Hey, this is Mike Lindsay from Vital MX. We're out here at Washougal MX Park for the 2025 Kawasaki KX250 launch. I'm personally quite excited. If you watched our channel or read any of our content for a while, you probably know I'm a big Kawi guy. I try to keep my opinions even, but I grew up riding KX250s, so I'm always excited to get on the latest generation Team Green machine. And there are quite a few changes this year. A lot of them will look familiar coming off the changes we saw to the 24 KX450, but there are a few unique things that have been brought in for the 250. So primarily why the chassis has changed is because of engine changes. We now have a shock tower that is lower in the bike that has allowed them to bring the intake track above the shock tower. It gives it a steeper drop into the engine. It's actually less intake angle now. Instead of the air having to come in straight and then go down, it drops in and has a little bit less curvature it has to do to get down into that combustion chamber. Coming out the front of the motor, same thing. Everything's a little more centered up. We have a higher engine cradle. Voila, we're back to the two-stroke era. All the OEMs have been doing this, and we have a center port exhaust. Unlike the 450, it is not an oval port. It is actually a standard round port. A couple other things have changed in the engine to be associated with this is we now have a cylinder head that's slanted because they had to bring that intake cam up. We have longer intake valves to work with that port. The angle on the intake valve face has changed a little bit as well, along with some small changes in the piston, all related to how the combustion chamber and the valves sit into it because of that different angle now. Another big performance change in this bike is the second injector is now placed in the top of the air boot before it drops in, so that angle is quite a bit different in the positioning of that second injector. Kawi still has that. And then, as we all saw last year, the KX450 had a very different air box. It's very choked down. We commented, a lot of people have commented about cutting them up, trying to get a little more airflow. The KX250 has its own airbox design and part number. It has a larger domed filter, which got introduced on the 25 KX450, but the airbox overall has a ton of material removed to it compared to that 450 airbox to allow this 250 to breathe as it needs to for that high RPM performance. One other major change to the engine, and one of the few things that we see on the bottom end, is that the engine now has a counterbalancer to try to remove some of the vibration and give it an overall smoother character. It also changes the engine inertia a little bit. So starting with that engine, let's get straight to the on-track comments. What's it like? The outgoing KX250 was a screamer. Amazing mid to top performance, a very lively engine, very fun, very sharp, crisp throttle response, very connected, but it lacked low end. That's been a very common theme of OEMs going to larger bore, shorter stroke. We're getting these better mid to top performances, but we're losing out on bottom end. The KX250 motor on the outgoing bike was still fairly well balanced. Again, more of a mid to top, not terrible down low, but not as good as it could be. They really wanted to get back to having good low to mid performance on this without sacrificing, in their words. And yes, this bike has better low to mid performance. It has better pickup, it has better recovery character, it has a better roll-on torque feel. Has it sacrificed anywhere? A little bit. It's not as playful of an engine. It feels like it takes a little bit longer to spool up and spool down through the mid-range on. Now don't get me wrong, I don't want to sound contradictory. It spools up quicker off the bottom from low to mid, but then mid to top it takes a little bit longer to build. It is a more linear, drawn out character. This is probably, you hear me say linear, drawn out character with a lot of engines these days. OEMs are moving that direction. The bikes are easier to ride because that power is drawn out over a longer period of time. It's good on track, it's tractable, it's easy to use, but at times it's not as exciting. I do miss a little bit of the playful nature of the outgoing engine and some of that screamy top end character, but I have to admit this engine is going to be better in most people's hands. It is easier to ride, and again, the recovery character is better. It doesn't penalize you as much for making a mistake and getting, in a place where you're hammering the clutch as much as like you were on the old bike. Has it actually lost any performance up top? I'd say no. The actual pure horsepower output feels very similar at the top end. Again, it's just how quickly it builds through the top end character. What else is going on with the chassis? Well, again, this looks like the KX450 chassis, and initially that is what Kawasaki told us. However, this bike actually has a different part number for the frame, and the frame is slightly different. It has a 0.4 of a degree more relaxed steering head angle, which is closer to the outgoing bike. I say that because when Kawi on the 450 went from 23 to 24, they brought that angle in 1 degree. On this 250, they've only brought it in a little more over ½ degree, and I quite like that. Again, on the 450, we got that degree in, there's more weight on the front end, it is the best turning KX450 ever. The KX250, they only brought it in a little bit, so still a little more weight on the front, a little bit better planted front end feel, but it's not too much in my opinion. I like this split better because it doesn't feel like the front tire is quite as under you. It feels not only a little more stable, but the steering input feels a little bit longer. It's not as reactive to the surface, which is noticeable out here at Washougal because the ruts in the berms are pretty edgy. It's kind of clumpy in the morning. There's a lot of stuff that would knock the front end around. So again, the chassis, very similar to how Kawai's been doing this. They still have good comfort. That is something that Kawai has. They have a nice, stable feel, but it has a better overall balanced front to rear on basically steering capability. It steers well from the front, it steers well from the rear. It feels like a bike that can be used in both ways. Moving into the suspension, this is interesting. So the KX250 has moved to the Showa components from the 450. No longer do we have a split with the 250 having KYB and the 450 having Showa. It is the same fork size, same shock body, everything that we see on the 450. And with that, we have a shock that's been repositioned. The shock has been shrunk, the shock is shorter, but that is the packaging of the shock. The stroke is still the same. So the shock does not have less travel, but it is a smaller shock. Interestingly enough, they are running the same spring rates front and rear on this that they are on the 450. We have a 5.0 in the front and a 5.4 in the rear, both Newton meter. I was initially very concerned with this because I thought the same thing with on the KX250, the 5.0 that's typically found on a 450 in the fork, I feel like is too much. I'm 195 pounds, so I am oversized for a 250 right now. And I still think that the spring rate is a little bit overkill. It does help the bike from bottoming, it does help the bike from being pitchy. This bike feels very level out of the box. It doesn't really teeter-totter. It doesn't squat too far either direction. It feels very level at all times, which is confidence inspiring. When the bike is level, it doesn't take a lot of energy to ride because you're not constantly getting pitched each way with the motorcycle. However, running the 5.0 in the front, most of the changes I made today were to try to get the fork to initially settle a little bit more. I was talking about some of the clumpiness of Washougal. There was just some deflection feel. The fork just felt like it had tension initially. So I went slower on my rebound. I went softer on my compression. Got it working pretty well. But overall, I still think for your usual target 250 rider, let's say you've got a smaller kid coming on these, 130, 140, 150 pounds, I think the spring rates are a little bit overkill. Surprisingly, the rear shock works pretty well with the 5.4 on it. And from talking to one of the Showa guys, the valving setting on this is almost identical to the 450, with the fork being a little bit stiffer actually. The balance feels better. The 450, partially with the softer fork setting and the inertia, feels kind of pitchier on the front end. The rear shock feels like it overpowers it. The 250 today is the opposite. It is pretty level, if not slightly overpowering on the rear. I know a lot of other guys today went stiffer on the rear shock. I personally did not because I like a bike that squats just a little bit. So all my changes were related to the fork, getting it to settle. At that 5.0 rate in the front though, it has plenty of hold up and it is overall more comfortable than the KYB fork they had before. I know that's shocking for most people to hear. You think KYB, you think, for instance, Yamaha, and you think a lot of comfort. The setting that was in the old KX250 just wasn't that good. That fork was harsh, had too much hold up, didn't really move enough. This fork definitely has a better stroke feel. It moves through on braking chop better, acceleration chop, anything. It just moves through the stroke a little more freely, but I still think it has a little too much tension feel initially. Overall, now let's bring this package together and talk about it on track. What is it like compared to the older bike? I do think in a lot of ways it is more comfortable than the outgoing bike. I feel like the frame is fairly even in terms of comfort, but I think the suspension complements this bike better. I think it feels, again, more level. It doesn't feel as harsh on the front end. It is a bit more comfortable. However, in those words, I still think they could find more comfort on the front end of this motorcycle. The engine character is easier to ride. It is more forgiving, but I feel like, again, it's a little bit more drawn out, not as exciting. And it has, because it isn't as free feeling, it has a little bit more engine braking character. It feels a little bit more loaded on decel. We tried a couple maps today. Kawi is a little bit newer into their mapping options than, say, Yamaha is. We'll get that one up on the screen. There was a map they called the Tickle map today. It's a minor change, but it did free up the engine a little bit on engine braking. They do have a new cluster switch for the 250. You have a mode, light on, light off. You have traction control, you have a launch control, and a kill switch. I still am not a huge fan of their mode switch because it has a base map and an aggressive map when the light is on. So different than the 450, which is standard, light off, and mellow when the light is on, or standard light off, aggressive light on the 250. That aggressive map is just a variation of the base map that is more aggressive. Whatever map you load into the base setting, the light on is always going to be a more aggressive version of whatever map you load into it. You cannot load two different maps into it, one the light off, one light on. You can only load one map, and the light on is just a variation of that map, if that makes sense. I complained about this on the 450. I wish you had the ability to actually place two different maps on the buttons, because for riders that haven't done as many mapping changes, it allows you to actually go back and forth on the track and figure out which one you like better instead of having to come in and make a change every time. I do like that we have that app control through the KX Rideology app now, that we're getting more adjustability, but I still think it could be a little bit more consumer friendly. KX still has a ton of ergo options. You have the two different post holes in the triple clamps, flip around bar mounts, and they're the only OEM that you can drop the foot pegs. I'm not tall enough to use it. I'm 5'9" with the leg length of somebody that's about 5'4", so sorry, I'm out there from being able to help you. I know a lot of different people that tried the lower foot peg option that do enjoy it, even if they're not in the terribly tall area. Guys that are 5'10" up, I know that have tried it, really do enjoy it. Overall, do I think this is better than the outgoing bike? As a general package, yes, out of the box. Again, the suspension is better, the chassis balance is better, the engine is more rideable, but I'm kind of 50-50 split. To me, the engine is better in some ways, but I like the old engine in other ways. So I'm not saying the new engine is completely better, but I'm not saying it's worse. It's kind of like a 50-50 trade for me. There's things I like about each, but I do think the engine direction they're going complements the whole bike. The bike is $100 more than last year's model with all these updates. It is about a little over 3 pounds heavier because of some of the engine changes, bringing the counterbalancer, changing the air box, and the way it routes over adds a bit of material, so that's to be expected. On track weight, it does feel a little bit heavier in the outgoing bike because also the outgoing bike had a more playful engine character, which allows you to bounce it around, where this is a little bit more linear and drawn out, not as exciting. Some of that weight is because the bike isn't as responsive on the engine character side. One last little item to cover I think that's interesting, because I got asked this by a few people before I came to the intro. What about the front brake? The KX450 has a Brembo unit for both the master cylinder and the brake caliper. The 250 stayed with the Nissan. I asked the team why, and they said they felt like the braking performance wasn't as big of an issue on their 250 and that their test riders didn't ever really complain, so they chose to stick with the standard Nissan unit. That's also not a surprise to me because the Nissan unit is likely to be cheaper than the Brembo, so if you do not have riders complaining about it, then you will stick with the option that is getting the job done without costing as much money. Overall, I enjoyed the KX250. I always enjoy Kawi's. I love the ergos on this motorcycle. I love a lot of the adjustability. I think there's some positive with this bike. I think there's some stuff that's a trade-off from the old one. I do love the fact that it didn't get terribly more expensive. So if you are looking for a new KX250, hopefully I've answered some of your questions. If you want to know anything else, please throw it in the comment section below and I'll do my best to get to answering those. As always, thanks for watching and stay tuned for more on Vital MX.